When Mark and Linda Carter bought the old Spanish-style house in Pacific Palisades, they thought they had found their dream home. The property was charming yet unassuming, nestled on a quiet street lined with sycamores. They hadn't even realized it once belonged to Walter Matthau until after they moved in. Mark, a screenwriter, and Linda, a real estate agent, had spent months searching for the perfect place. The Matthau house wasn't their first choice. There were structural issues, and the backyard needed work, but something about it drew them in. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light filtered through the arched windows, or the whisper of Hollywood history embedded in its walls. At first, the disturbances were small. Doors left ajar when neither of them had opened them. The faint smell of cigar smoke drifting through the hallway, though neither of them smoked. Linda brushed it off as new house jitters. Mark, ever the storyteller, joked that maybe old Walter wasn't ready to leave just yet. But soon the joke stopped. One night, as Mark worked late in his office, he heard footsteps outside the room. Heavy, deliberate. He assumed it was Linda, but when he called out, there was no response. Peering into the hallway, he found nothing but silence. Linda had her own encounters. While folding laundry in the bedroom, she heard a deep, gravelly chuckle coming from the adjoining bathroom, low, familiar, almost amused. The same laugh she'd heard countless times in classic films. Then came the shadow. It started in the living room, where the couple often saw movement from the corner of their eyes, something shifting just beyond their vision. One evening, as Linda poured a glass of wine, she turned to find a dark figure standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. Before she could scream, it was gone. Disturbed but unwilling to be scared out of their home, the Carters did research. They learned that Walter Matthau had lived there for decades, right up until his death in 2000. The house had been a refuge for him, a place where he entertained friends, read scripts, and smoked his beloved cigars. Determined to make peace with whatever presence lingered, they tried speaking to it. One night, Mark poured a glass of whiskey, set it on the mantel and said, "If you're still here, Walter, we mean no harm. We love this house just as much as you did." For weeks after, the disturbances lessened. The smell of cigars faded. The shadow stopped appearing. The house felt lighter, as if a quiet understanding had been reached. But every now and then, when the television flickered late at night, Mark would hear it, that unmistakable chuckle, warm and knowing, as if Matthau himself was watching along. The house had settled. At least that's what Mark told himself. The unease that had clung to the walls like old paint had faded, replaced by something quieter, something almost watchful. The disturbances hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had changed, softened. No more dark figures in the doorway, no more phantom footsteps in the night. Just the occasional scent of tobacco curling through the air, the flicker of a lamp dimming for no reason, the faintest pressure on the cushions of the couch as if someone had just risen from them. Linda had started leaving little acknowledgments for the presence. A crystal ashtray on the coffee table, though neither of them smoked. A book of classic Hollywood gossip, placed conspicuously near the armchair. When she walked through the living room, she would sometimes murmur, "Good evening, Walter." The way one might greet an old neighbor passing by the gate. It wasn't fear that kept them up at night anymore. It was something else, a kind of anticipation. Then came the music. Mark was the first to notice. Late one evening, after Linda had gone to bed, he was sitting in his study, bathed in the glow of his laptop screen. The air was still, the street outside quiet. And then, drifting up from the living room, faint but unmistakable music. A piano, soft and deliberate, playing a melody he couldn't quite place. It was slow, melancholic, the kind of tune that lingered in the bones long after it ended. He thought, at first, it must be coming from outside. A neighbor's window open, a radio left playing. But when he walked downstairs, the sound was stronger, richer, as though it were coming from within the walls themselves. There was no piano in the house. The music stopped the moment he stepped into the living room. The air smelled faintly of something aged, something like the dust of an old stage curtain or the well-worn fabric of a favorite armchair. The house was quiet again, utterly still. Mark didn't mention it to Linda right away. He didn't want to unsettle her, not when things had finally begun to feel normal. But 2 nights later, as they lay in bed with the windows cracked open to let in the coastal breeze, she stirred beside him. "Do you hear that?" Mark's stomach tightened. Faintly, like a whisper through the walls, the piano was playing again. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The melody was softer this time, almost hesitant, as if the unseen pianist was unsure whether they were being listened to. The notes unfurled slowly, filling the spaces between the shadows, settling into the stillness of the house like dust in an old theater. Mark lay frozen beside Linda, his heartbeat threading itself into the rhythm of the music. Neither of them spoke. They just listened. It wasn't a song Mark recognized, and yet it felt familiar, like something half-remembered from a dream. A tune hummed absent-mindedly in childhood. It carried a wistfulness, a nostalgia that made the back of his throat tighten. Linda, still curled beside him, barely breathed. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with expectation. Mark turned his head slightly, trying to make out Linda's expression in the dim glow of the bedside clock. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You heard it this time." It wasn't a question. Mark swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah." They lay there for a long time, neither moving, listening for anything else that might break the stillness. But the house had returned to its usual quiet, the kind that should have felt comforting but didn't. Linda exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding in. "I think it was As Time Goes By," she murmured. Mark frowned. "The Casablanca song?" She nodded against the pillow. Walter Matthau loved old Hollywood. Maybe. She hesitated, then shook her head. Mark turned onto his side, studying her face. "Maybe what?" Linda licked her lips, as though unsure she wanted to give voice to the thought forming in her mind. Finally, she said, "Maybe he's just reminiscing." The idea was strange, but not entirely unsettling. If there was something lingering in the house, it didn't feel malicious. It felt more like an echo of something that had once been, a life that had played out between these walls, laughter that had drifted through these rooms, memories that had settled into the very foundation. And yet, the air still carried that charged quality, the way it does before a storm, or before an actor steps onto a stage. Linda turned onto her side, facing Mark. "We should find out more about him," she said. "About how he lived here." Mark hesitated. He had always been fascinated by history, by stories and the weight they carried. But this was different. This was their home. And yet, wasn't it still someone else's in some way? After a long moment, he nodded. "Yeah, let's find out." Neither of them slept much that night. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the arched windows, cutting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The house looked different in the daylight, less haunted, more ordinary. It was almost absurd to think that, just hours ago, they had lain awake listening to the ghost of an old Hollywood star play an invisible piano. Over breakfast, Linda was the first to bring it up. She sat at the kitchen island, stirring her coffee absently, staring out toward the backyard. "We should go to the library today," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mark glanced up from his laptop. "The library?" She nodded. "See if we can find any old records. News articles, interviews, anything about the house. I don't know, I feel like there's something we're missing." Mark hesitated. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off as some half-sleep delusion, but he couldn't. The music had been real. The presence in the house was real. And now, curiosity itched at the edges of his mind. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." They drove to the Los Angeles Public Library, a grand old building that smelled of aged paper and polished wood. Linda led the way to the archives, where they spent hours sifting through articles, flipping through microfilm, and scrolling past decades-old headlines. It was Mark who found it first. An old interview from the early 90s, buried in the entertainment section of the Los Angeles Times. The journalist had visited Matthau in his Pacific Palisades home, describing it in vivid detail: the sunken living room, the Spanish tiles, the grand old oak desk where he kept his scripts. And then, a paragraph that made the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. He keeps a piano in the corner, an antique upright, though he doesn't play much anymore. Used to, he says with a wistful smile, running a hand across the keys. Not much of a musician, but I like to tinker. Mostly old standards, things I heard in the movies growing up. He pauses for a moment, then chuckles. You know what I'd play over and over? As time goes by. My wife used to joke that if I ever haunted the place, that's what people would hear in the middle of the night. Mark read the paragraph again, and again. His pulse quickened. Linda, he murmured, turning the screen toward her. She leaned in, scanning the text. Then, slowly, she exhaled. Oh my God! They sat there for a long moment, neither speaking. The library buzzed around them, the hum of conversations, the distant clatter of books being reshelved. But between them, there was only silence. Mark felt his throat tighten. It was one thing to suspect something, to feel a presence in the house. But to see it in black and white, to know that Walter himself had joked about this very thing? It wasn't a haunting. Not in the way people thought of ghosts, the rattling chains, the cold spots, the whispered threats. No, this was something else. A man who had loved his home. A man who, perhaps, had never really left. And as they sat in the quiet hum of the library, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that, even now, the house was waiting for them to return. The drive back from the library was quiet, the city rolling past them in warm, golden hues. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the streets, and in the distance, the Pacific shimmered under the fading light. But neither Mark nor Linda spoke much. The weight of what they had read still lingered between them. Mark kept one hand on the wheel, the other tapping absently against his knee. His mind was looping through the words of that article, replaying the image of Walter Matthau at his old upright piano, running a hand across the keys. Had the journalist known, even then, that they were capturing something eternal? That those words, thrown out with a chuckle, might one day feel less like a joke and more like a prophecy? Linda sat with her elbow propped against the window, watching the streets blur past. She had barely touched her phone since they left the library, which was unusual for her. He could see the gears turning in her head, the way they always did when she was working through something. Finally, as they turned onto their quiet street, she exhaled and said, "What do we do with this?" Mark didn't answer right away. He pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and stared at the house. It looked the same as always, quaint, welcoming, a little weathered around the edges but full of charm. Nothing about it screamed haunted. And yet, now that they knew, now that they had confirmation, he felt it. Presence. Not looming, not menacing. Just there. He turned to Linda. "We go inside," he said simply, "and we see if he's still listening." She didn't argue. The house was cool when they stepped inside, the lingering heat of the day already retreating into the walls. The wooden beams overhead stretched like the ribs of an old ship, steady, enduring. Mark set the library printouts down on the coffee table and glanced around the living room, half expecting something to shift in the corner of his vision. Nothing did. Linda walked over to the bookshelf, trailing her fingers along the spines of old hardcovers left by the previous owners. The house had come partially furnished, its bones still holding pieces of the past. She paused near the corner where a piano might have once stood, tilting her head slightly as if listening for something. Then, very deliberately, she said, "Walter, we read about your piano today." The air was still. Mark swallowed. He wasn't sure what they were expecting: an answer? A sign? He had spent his whole life fascinated by stories of the unexplained. But now that he was standing in one, he realized how little he understood about the nature of such things. Linda continued, her voice soft, almost conversational. "We read that you used to play as time goes by, and that your wife thought if you ever haunted this place, that's what people would hear." The silence stretched. Mark wasn't sure why he did it, maybe instinct, maybe some deep-seated need to fill the quiet, but he pulled out his phone and searched for the song. When he found an old recording, he hit play. The first notes of As Time Goes By floated into the air, smooth and rich, the melody weaving through the room like it belonged there. Linda turned to him, eyes wide. And then, something changed. Not a sound, not an object moving, something deeper, something intangible. The atmosphere of the house shifted, like the slow intake of breath before a spoken word. The temperature remained steady, but Mark swore he felt a shift in pressure, as if the house itself was leaning in. The song played on, filling every corner of the room, and for a moment, just a moment, Mark could almost see it. A man, sitting at an old upright piano, his fingers pressing against well-worn keys, a half-smoked cigar resting in a nearby ashtray, a wistful smile, the kind that carried both nostalgia and amusement. And then, just as the song reached its final, lingering notes, the unmistakable scent of cigar smoke curled through the air. Faint, subtle, gone in seconds. Mark and Linda exchanged glances, their hearts pounding in sync. He was still here, and he had been listening. The scent of cigar smoke dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling it left behind lingered. Mark and Linda remained frozen in place, their eyes meeting across the dimly lit room. The song had ended, but the air still carried a kind of charged stillness, like the echo of a conversation just after the words have been spoken. Linda was the first to break the silence. "You smelled that, right?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah." She exhaled, slow and measured, as if grounding herself. Then, after a long pause, she walked to the coffee table and picked up the library printouts. She flipped through them, glancing at the paragraph about Walter's piano once more. Then, carefully, she folded the pages and set them aside. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself. "He's here." The certainty in her voice sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Not fear, something else. The weight of understanding. Neither of them spoke for a while. Their house, felt different now. Not ominous, not oppressive. Just occupied. And not in a way that required them to leave. Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "So what now? We live with him." Linda let out a soft, breathy laugh. "I mean, he's already living with us." Mark chuckled despite himself, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess he is." They left the living room lights on that night. Not out of fear, more like an unspoken courtesy, the way you'd leave a porch light on for a friend who might be arriving late. Days passed, and though nothing as direct as the music or the cigar smoke happened again, the house still felt aware. Little things continued. The occasional cold spot near the corner where the piano had once stood. A book shifting slightly on the coffee table when no one was looking. The feeling of being watched, not with malice, but with curiosity. Then, one evening, Mark was alone in the house. Linda had gone to visit a friend, leaving him with a quiet night to himself. He sat at his desk, typing notes for a script idea that had been forming in his head. It wasn't going well. The words felt clunky, forced. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. Then faintly a sound. Not music this time. Something else. A breath? A sigh? He sat up straight, his pulse quickening. "Walter?" he asked the empty room. No response. Mark let out a nervous chuckle. "If you have any script notes, now's the time." The silence stretched. Then, from the living room, the softest creak. Not a footstep exactly, but the sound of weight shifting like someone settling into an armchair. Mark turned his head toward the doorway, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't get up. He didn't move at all. He just sat there, breathing, waiting, listening. Nothing else happened. But somehow that was enough. Later that night, when Linda returned, Mark told her about it. She listened without interrupting, nodding thoughtfully as she placed her bag on the counter. "Maybe he's just keeping you company," she said. Mark considered that. It didn't feel wrong. If anything, it felt oddly fitting. He glanced toward the living room, where the light from the hallway barely touched the edges of the furniture. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. As the weeks passed, Mark and Linda stopped questioning the presence in their home. Walter, if it was truly him, wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. He was a memory imprinted in the house, a lingering essence that had no desire to frighten, only to remain. They learned to live with the small, inexplicable moments, the occasional whiff of cigar smoke, the subtle creak of an unseen presence settling into an armchair, the faintest hum of a melody, barely audible but undeniably there. One evening, Mark and Linda sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the table lamp casting warm shadows against the walls. Linda had poured them both a glass of wine, and Mark, feeling a quiet impulse, pulled up as time goes by once more. As the first notes drifted through the air, Linda smiled, glancing toward the empty corner where the piano had once stood. "Thank you for sharing your home with us, Walter," she said softly. For the first time in months, the air carried no response, no shifting sounds, no faint scent of tobacco, just silence. And yet, in that silence, there was peace. Perhaps Walter had finally said his goodbyes, or perhaps he was simply content. Either way, Mark and Linda knew the truth. The house had never truly been empty, and maybe, just maybe, it never would be. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.